Good to see all of you today. We're taking a break from our Acts study, though I thought we stopped at a very fitting point, Acts 17. Rick spent some time last week, talking about Paul and how he reasoned with them, right? Proving from the scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah, that he must die and rise again. And so we're going to spend the next, I think it's like 10, 11, maybe 12 weeks, kind of similar to last year, right? Last year we did an apologetic series in the summer. Felt like it was pretty well received. Okay, we did things a little bit differently last year. We started off with the kind of like general apologetic stuff, and we're going to do some of that this time as well. But then last year we kind of dove into specific dealing with other views, right? We looked at Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and the New Age and stuff like that, atheism, right? These opposing views, and focused on how can we? What are some tools? What are some things that we can do to talk to people from those viewpoints, right? This year we're doing something a little bit different. So instead of necessarily, I guess last year was maybe more polemical in the sense that. Well, not that we were attacking people, but you're dealing with other people's particular worldviews, right? This year we'll do some general apologetics, okay? And then we're going to dive into clarifying questions, okay? If you're curious, the book that we're kind of using as a guide is called I'm Glad You Asked by Kenneth Boa and Larry Moody. Not that we, have to agree or even have to teach everything from that book, but it gives a good framework of questions to go through, and I'll put those on the screen later today. But to start, I wanted to, and the youth have heard some of this already, and so now you'll really remember it, right? Teaching it in the adult class here. I wanted to start with an apologetic for apologetics, and then we'll spend a little bit of time on the existence of God. I had a professor at seminary, Norman Geisler. If any of you heard of Norm Geisler? He's with the Lord now, right? He was the apologetics guy, probably one of the most prominent Christian apologists of the 20th century, right? And I got to sit under just one class with him, Intro to Christian Apologetics, right? And that was the class, right? That was the class you had to take if you went to Southern Evangelical Seminary. You have to take this class with Dr. Norman Geisler, right? And he taught well, like he was up in his 80s, right? And he was teaching this class, and towards the end you could see that he doesn't quite have the fire, but he had a lot of fire even up and to the end. He was known as Storm and Norman because he was very into Christian apologetics, into teaching believers how to not only just understand what they believe, but also to know why they believe it, giving the reasons for what they believe. And one of the things that he would say is that if you long to know the mind of God, you must learn to use your own. If you long to know the mind of God, you must use your own. And so there's this idea, and I think this is scripturally supported, that understanding the truth of God, right? Understanding what God has revealed about himself, whether it's through his word or through his world, requires not just spiritual discernment, but it also requires an application of your intellect, right? An application of reasoning. Come, let us reason. This isn't just a simple passive reception, okay? And I think, and I'm not going to give a big argument for this, but I think there has been a certain anti-intellectualism that has creeped into the church, okay? Some might argue that, it started with the first and second great awakenings, right? This emphasis on personal experience. Revival, right? How you feel about the faith. Others might trace it back to the holiness movements or even the fundamentalist movements, or when Darwin really came on the scene, a pullback from the university by Christians, right? A giving up at the university. But really for almost 2,000 years, knowing Jesus had a lot to do with knowing Scripture, knowing theology, knowing doctrine, having an intellectual pursuit of truth. This modern conception, not to speak negatively of it, but this modern conception of you need a personal relationship with Jesus, right? This personal, almost like my personal relationship with my wife, but it's more than that. It's so much more than that, right? Not to speak negatively of that, but having a relationship with Jesus historically has involved the use of your mind, right? The use of reasoning. And some have, taken offense or whatever at the state of evangelicalism. Mark Knoll in his book, and he really starts it off in an interesting way. He wrote the book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And literally the first sentence, he says, the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind. Now, I don't know if you agree with that or disagree with that, but at least in my experience, it does seem that for a long time, the intellectual pursuit of truth has been downplayed over against emotions and feelings and quote-unquote personal relationship. Now, that is not to say that you shouldn't have a personal relationship with Jesus, but it is to say that I think part of that pursuit involves your mind. It involves your mind. In Mark 12, when asked what the greatest commandment was, Jesus said, the Lord God is one, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one. And then he says, love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. Right? Using one's mind is a form of devotion to God. If you long to know the mind of God, then you must use your own. And that is apologetics. That's the apologetics task, is applying our mind, right, to understanding God's truth and communicating it. Many Christians shy away from defending their faith, instead taking a take-it-on-faith attitude, right? I think that's a mistake, right? When our brothers and sisters have questions about their faith, right, the response shouldn't be, have faith. It should be, well, let us reason about this. Let us understand this. Peter exhorts believers to always be ready to make a defense when we are asked to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. So to start, let us define Christian apologetics. And I apologize for the image there. Little mishap, but it's like a double picture. This verse, though, in 1 Peter 3:15, that what's highlighted in red here, to make a defense, okay, that comes from the Greek word apologia, right, which translates to verbal defense or a speech in defense. It carries with it, I guess, the legal or lawyer type connotations. Lawyers are often thought of negatively, but in the sense of giving a defense for something, akin to the defense a lawyer might present in a courtroom setting. And so Christian apologetics, this word apologetics, you might think, oh, this is like an apology, like you say you're sorry for something. That's not what it's getting at, right? It's getting instead at a reasoned justification, right, or defense of the truth claims of Christianity. And so the legal connotation, I think, around this word would suggest that Christians should approach defending their faith, defending their beliefs. They should approach it with knowledge and evidence, some amount of logical argumentation, and some amount of applying your mind. And so to give a really brief definition, engaging in Christian apologetics is the act of providing a reasoned justification and defense for the truth claims of Christianity. Now, what's the purpose of apologetics? What is the purpose of it? Well, I can think of at least a couple, okay? The first being to strengthen the faith of believers, right? Christian apologetics can help address those personal doubts or those intellectual roadblocks that, let's be honest, each of us experience, each of us have, each of us go through and wrestle with, right? Apologetics helps reassure believers that there are sound reasons for the hope that they possess. I'm reminded of doubting Thomas, right? What did he say? He said, "I will not believe unless I see," right? Jesus comes and shows him the wounds in his hands and his side, and he says, be believing, not unbelieving, right? Blessed are those who believe and not see, right? Jesus isn't saying there, blessed are those who believe without evidence. What he's just simply pointing out to Thomas is that not everyone is going to be able to see Jesus, to see the wounds in his hands and the scars, in the scar in his side. Often that verse is used as, the Bible teaches you should believe without evidence. You should believe without reason. You should just have a blind faith. That's not what it's talking about at all, okay? And so apologetics can help strengthen the faith of believers. Secondly, it can help attract others to the gospel, a sort of pre-evangelism, removing obstacles to the faith. AKA, I heard one person put it, gospticles. I don't know if I like that word, it's hard to say. Obstacles to the gospel, right? Let's clear the brush. Let's clear the anything that stands between this person and the cross, right? Let's clear those things out of the way. Now, what apologetics isn't, it's not a sure, guaranteed way that you do this, that, or the other, and this person is going to believe, right? You've probably heard, the saying, you can bring a horse to water, you can't force it to drink, kind of thing, right? Right. Apologetics is bringing people to Jesus, right? At the end of the day, you can't force them to trust in him, but you can remove every reason for them not to. But why? Okay, so if the purpose of apologetics is to, number one, it helps reassure fellow believers, and two, it helps people. It's a sort of pre-evangelism, helping people come to and consider the gospel. Why should we engage in it? What reason is there to embark on this apologetic enterprise? I'm going to give you a couple. We've already looked at this verse, but Peter gives a direct command to do it, right? But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and respect. And so it's a direct command to be ready, right? To be able to give a defense, to explain their faith, right? To explain why they have this hope, to give an account for this hope. In 2 Corinthians 10, 4-5, Paul writes, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God." Right? We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. Do you know that there are arguments and pretensions or lofty opinions that are raised up against the knowledge of God. And Paul here is saying we are to destroy them, right? We are to demolish them. And this passage here highlights that there is a battle going on, though not with, weapons of the flesh, as it were, weapons, swords and whatever else, right? But there is a battle going on, a battle against false ideas that stand themselves up against the truth of God. We looked at this verse last week, right? Paul reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. So we have this example from Paul. He reasoned with others to persuade them to trust in Jesus. He reasoned. In Jude, there's a call to contend for the faith, that is, defend. Contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints, right? We are called to defend and guard the core doctrines of Christian faith against error. Contend for the faith. Colossians 4, 5-6. Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Paul here emphasizes having wisdom, right? Be wise in the way that you act towards outsiders, so that you may know how to answer everyone, right? There's this call to be prepared, right? Yes, be full of grace, right? Seasoned with salt, but know how to answer everyone. So why apologetics? Well, here's one reason for you. The Bible commands it, right? And if you seek to obey the scriptures, taking this apologetic task seriously is part of it, right? It's in there. We are called to take seriously the apologetic task. But why else might we consider apologetics? Why else might we seek to understand and defend the faith that was once and for all handed down to the saints? We live in a world and society with views, beliefs, habits, and the like that are directly opposed to the truth of God and the gospel. I'm just going to give you a few, okay? We have relativism, the idea that no view is absolutely true, right? Well, if this worldview is true, then no view is true, right? Which means Christianity is not true, that Jesus is not the Messiah. Pluralism. All views are relatively true. Another one. This is that's your truth kind of thing. Everything is relatively valid, and so on. Okay. Well, that stands up against, right up against what Christians believe, and we'll dive into that a little bit more here in a bit. Naturalism. No supernatural view is actually true. Okay. So our culture is deeply saturated in these dominant philosophies: relativism, pluralism, and naturalism. This is the cultural water we swim in. Relativism says there's no truth. Pluralism basically says there's no religious truth. Everything's relatively true. And naturalism says there's no supernatural truth. Do you see the problem with doing evangelism, with trying to persuade people or trying to get people to trust in Jesus as the truth, if these are the prevailing views of the day? These views are often they're expressed in various different ways, but we see them play out. Who are you to force your morality on me, right? As if there is no objective moral law, right? in pluralism, how can Jesus be the only way? Or hasn't science proven that miracles are impossible? If we don't take up the apologetic task and answer these false philosophies, we've essentially given up, and we've left others in Christ with no one else to defend and uphold them. C.S. Lewis wrote, and you could essentially replace the word philosophy here with apologetics, to be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their ground. And by the way, yes, I bet some of you were wondering, well, when is C.S. Lewis going to make an appearance? Here it is. To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their ground, would be to throw down our weapons and to betray our uneducated brethren who have, under God, no defense but us against the intellectual attacks of the heathen. Good philosophy, or good apologetics, must exist if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. So in contrast to those, to relativism, pluralism, and naturalism, Christianity is declaring an absolute truth, right? Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the Messiah. Right? God exists. Jesus rose from the dead, that you can only be right with God through Jesus, right? It's an exclusivistic message, as I just mentioned, right? And it's supernatural, right? Christianity is the exact opposite in terms of what these views are setting out. It's absolute. There is absolute truth. It's exclusivistic, right? There's only one way to God, the man Jesus Christ, and it's supernatural, right? Jesus rose from the dead. So why apologetics? The culture demands it, right? The culture demands that we do this. The culture must be answered. And so at least two reasons. I hope these are good enough for you. But the Bible commands it, and the culture demands it. And I'm indebted to Norm Geisler for fleshing this out. If you're ever interested, just look him up. I think he has a website. He's gone again with the Lord now, but his ministry carries on. I found a quote too that, because when we get into apologetics, I think the tendency, especially for me when I first went to seminary, started learning about apologetics, the tendency was to be, a bit overbearing, maybe. Maybe I was a cage stage apologist. Maybe you've heard that term, for cage stage Calvinism, cage stage this, cage stage that. It's that when you get into something new, you're just like all about it, super on fire for it, and anything, that's not that is just nope, right? Listen to my message a few weeks ago on the hills we die on. Each one of those things, each one of those hills, some people go through a phase where they're like very cage stage, like they're just, what'd you say? What'd you say against my view or whatever? Like, that's wrong, And I hope that message helped us temper that a bit. But I found this quote, and I really like it. I have no idea if Abraham Lincoln actually said this, but it said, if you would win a man to your cause, first convince him that you are his true friend. Therein is a drop of honey that catches his heart, which, say what he will, is the greatest highroad to his reason, and which, when once gained, you will find but little trouble in convincing his judgment of the justice of your cause, if indeed that cause be really a just one. And so, I hope he said it, but or wrote it, but I like the sentiment here, right? The apologetic task isn't just like boom, 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 here's a bunch of arguments, goodbye, right? Goodbye, right? We are still to actually care about people, right? You want to win them to your cause because they are your friend, right? They are a human created in God's image of eternal value, right? And you care for them. You desire the good for them. A simpler version of this is you catch more flies with honey than you do vinegar. I might be butchering that one. So, this is apologetics, okay? And what we're going to do this summer is we're going to focus on some big questions, okay? We couldn't fit all the questions in from the book, but here's the ones that we're going to go over. Is there really a God? And we're going to touch on that a little bit today. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on that because we've done this topic before, right? So we're going to just take a brief look at some arguments for the existence of God. Because at the end of the day, if you don't got God, then you can't really, okay? If there's no God, then there's no miracles, right? If there's no God, there's no miracles, there's no resurrection, right? So you kind of have to start there, right? And these questions are, we liked this book because the questions themselves these are the kind of questions that might come up in like a conversation with your friend who's not a believer, right? Well, you don't believe God exists? Let's talk about that. Or like, why should I believe in miracles? Well, maybe if you don't believe in God, then you're going to have a hard time believing in miracles, right? If you believe that God exists, then miracles are possible. You admit God, you have to admit the possibility of miracles. Well, then what about the miracle, right? The resurrection, right? How do we deal with that? Okay, if the resurrection is possible because God exists, now we start talking about evidence, right? Why is it reasonable to believe that Jesus predicted and accomplished his own death and resurrection? And so those are kind of the more general things. Then we get down into, does God make sense in a world full of suffering? This is the one thing that, if there's an argument against the existence of God, it's that if God, why evil, right? If God, why evil, right? So we'll be looking at that. And then we're going to dive into, more specific questions about Christianity. Is Christ the only way to God? Or will God judge those who have never heard about Christ? Have you guys ever asked that question? What if you've never heard about Jesus? Is that just? How do we deal with that question, right? We're going to skip over a couple, 8 and 9. We won't have time. We couldn't fit it into the summer series. Number 10, isn't salvation by faith too easy? It just seems too easy. Like, that doesn't seem right. So we'll talk a little bit about salvation. What does the Bible mean by believe? And then, can anyone be sure of their salvation? Can anyone really have assurance? Assurance is a really important thing, right? How do I know I'm saved? So those are the questions we'll be diving into during this study. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the first question. Does God exist? And this question can be formed in various ways, right? Is there really a God? Can you actually prove that God exists? Hasn't science demonstrated that the idea of God is unnecessary? Or, why postulate a God when science explains the origin of the universe? It'd be a anti-supernatural view. On this question, there are 3 possibilities, or at least there's 3 possibilities in terms of your posture of belief, okay? On the question itself, there's only 2 options. God either exists or he doesn't, right? It's pretty simple. Yes or no, right? But in terms of what you believe about this question, what you assent to or what you hold in your mind, there are 3 options. 1, God does not exist. So that's atheism, okay? I believe that there is no God. 2, God may exist. Agnosticism, okay? Or 3, I may believe that God does exist. These are in terms of belief, these are the options, right? I believe God exists. I don't know if God exists. He may exist. Or I believe that God exists. Now, there's been a great deal of debate over this question. Does God exist? Arguments for and against the existence of God. What I'd like to do, hey girls. They gone. What I'd like to do is start by showing you the unreasonableness of the first position. Okay? Now, this is not to say that there's millions of people out there who believe that God does not exist. right? But I would say it's unreasonable to hold the position, okay? It's very unreasonable to hold the position. And I'm going to tell you why. David in Psalm 14:1, he says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And, I've read this verse a few times, and it is an interesting, well, what does he mean the fool in his heart says there is no God? There's some people who have legitimate obstacles and legitimate struggles with this question. What do you mean the fool in his heart says there is no God? Well, when you think about it, it is a foolish thing to say. Consider what you would have to know that God does not exist. And we're going to do a little exercise. The youth have seen this already, so maybe you guys should come up here and teach this part. Matthew? It's been a while? Okay, in the tabula rasa of your mind, imagine a circle, okay? Imagine a circle. And let's just call that total reality. Everything that exists, everything that can be known, okay? You got it? There's an image there in case you're not very imaginative. Okay, so in that big circle, draw a small circle, okay? And let's say that's human knowledge, okay? Now again, I don't know if this is proportionate, but I would say human knowledge probably is very small in terms of all that can be known. Would you agree? Yeah, very small. Okay, so we have total reality, everything that can be known, right? Then you have human knowledge, everything that human beings collectively know, okay? Now, in that smaller circle, put a little dot. And let's call that individual knowledge, or your knowledge of reality. The things that you know, okay? This probably, I hope, puts in perspective the fact that each of us individually know very little, right? Even if you take the human race as a whole, we'd probably agree that we don't know a lot, right? The universe is finite, but it's seemingly infinite, right? We're coming up with new theories and new this and that every year, every decade that replaces the old thing, and then the new thing that's not right, so it gets replaced, so on and so forth. But the idea that you can know that God does not exist doesn't really make sense, because for you to know that God does not exist, you would have to kind of know everything, right? What if God exists outside your little bubble, right? You'd have to have comprehensive knowledge of the universe. You would have to know everything. You'd have to be omniscient. You'd have to be, I don't know, maybe you'd have to be God, right? To know that God doesn't exist, okay? This doesn't mean you can't believe there is no God. What I'm saying is you can't know there is no God. You would have to have exhaustive knowledge. And I think this is why David says that the fool says in his heart, there is no God, right? This doesn't mean that because you can't know that God doesn't exist, that doesn't mean that God definitely exists, right? It only means that you can't know that God does not exist. And so, all of that to say is, atheism is not a very reason to say that there is no God, okay? It's not a reasonable position to hold, right? That there is no God, any God at all, right? It's not a reasonable position to hold, because you can't know what you need to know that.
So is the big circle, should it be related as things we don't want to know exist?
Things we don't want to know exist. Yeah. Yeah. Again, this doesn't prove very much. It doesn't tell you that there is a God, right? But it does tell you that, hey, the person who says there is no God, and they say they know there is no God, they're not being very intellectually honest, okay? So with that, the second option, agnosticism. God may exist. And this is where you're actually dealing with, you're dealing with something that you can kind of work with. Not saying that you can't work with atheists, but that there's an open consideration. God could exist, right? He may exist, right? This is often expressed in phrases like, I don't know whether God exists. And I think the difficulty with this is a lot of times, what kind of evidence does the agnostic want, right? What is the evidence that would convince somebody that would change their God may exist to I believe that God does exist, okay? And one of the difficulties is that, God, our definition of God, he's immaterial. He's not something perceived by our five senses, okay? And so we must rely on reasoning, right? We must apply our minds and look at and rely upon the evidence of cause and effect. We'll get into that in a little bit. Now, I did something interesting a few weeks ago. I asked AI whether it was more reasonable that God exists or that the universe is just brute fact. Okay, what that means is the universe is just basically either there's an eternal God or the universe is eternal. Okay, and I asked it, what is more reasonable? And I was blown away by the response. I'll just come over here and read it. I said, I'm not going to get too close. That thing will start. What do you think is more probable, that there is a super foundational, necessary, not contingent, principle or cause of the universe? It's God, by the way. Or that the universe is brute fact? I believe these are the only two ways to stop the regress, so that's why I asked about these two. I don't need a super long explanation. Keep it relatively short. And the AI came back and said, between super foundational, necessary principle or cause, i.e. a self-existent entity, or the universe as brute fact, I lean toward the necessary cause is more probable. Here's why. I was like, what? That's crazy. So AI believes in God. No, I'm just kidding. But I just thought it was really, really interesting. And then I went on, because the thing with AI is it just tends to be agreeable with you. Right? It tends to be agreeable with you and not really try to challenge you. And so I said, back to your answer, are you just saying this to be agreeable? Or do you really think a necessary first cause is more probable? And then it said, I appreciate you circling back to ensure I'm being straight with you. I'm not just saying it to be agreeable. My lean toward a necessary first cause being more probable than a brute fact is based on reasoning. Can't reason, but they'll admit it's a close call and not a definitive stance. Here's why I think it, keeping it short and honest. So I thought that was very interesting. So I don't know why I included that in this presentation, but I just thought it was interesting. The kids thought it was funny. At the end of the day, though, and this is something I hold, I don't think that God's existence can be demonstrated to somebody with the kind of certainty that forces them to believe. That forces them to believe. I think that throughout history, through Christian history, great effort has been made to engage with these kinds of questions, engage with the question of, does God exist? What reasons are there to suppose that God exists? And we're going to look at a couple of those arguments here in a bit. I do think they stop short of providing a absolute irresistible proof, right? And why do because because this is an intellectual exercise. This is a philosophical exercise, okay? This isn't mathematics, right? You can't have mathematical certainty, which is a kind of certainty, with history. What kind of certainty can you have with history? You have a historical certainty, right? They're different kinds of things that you're knowing, right? With philosophy, you may reach some type of philosophical certainty. But I don't think that there is an irresistible, irrefutable thing that's going to force this person to believe. And I think, why do I think this? Because I think if that were the case, then there'd be a lot more people who would bend the knee to the cross, right? I think that we wouldn't really have to do the apologetic task. There'd just be like, here you go. But at the end of the day, God desires people to choose him freely. He desires people to love him freely, okay? God desires a genuine relationship with people, not just a forced compliance. And so something like a proof or an argument that is just irrefutable, that, I think, overrides human freedom. True love, true faith requires the freedom to say yes or to say no. So, with that, I have a lot more notes here that I'm going to present. Let's jump into, never mind, story time. And I remember, I want to share this story just because I feel like it kind of falls in line with that idea. Kendra, she'll remember this. In seminary, she was taking an evangelism class, Evangelism 101 or whatever it was, right? And in that class, she had to go and do a couple like evangelistic type activities. And I forgot exactly the assignment for you, but it was something to the effect of like, you have to go out and do some evangelism and log what the people say and what you said back and how it went, kind of thing, right? And there was this, you guys know about Matthew's Alive, right? It's this big thing that happens in Matthew's. I don't know why it happens. It's the thing that Matthew's does. But we were living in Matthew's at the time, like, hey, there's this thing, like there's gonna be tons of people there. We can just go out, we'll be sneaky and be like, hey, we're just asking, we're taking a spiritual inventory, just asking some basic questions and stuff like that. And so I went with Kendra, and I forgot the specific question we asked, but we eventually get to like, do you believe that God exists, right? And there was this guy named Jack. It was Jack and his girlfriend. And we were talking with him, and you didn't talk much. You didn't back me up very much. I still remember that. I'm just kidding. We were talking with Jack and his girlfriend, and the girlfriend was kind of disengaged, but he was like, yeah, I'll answer some questions or whatever. And we got to like, do you believe that God exists? And he said, no, I don't believe that there's any evidence for the existence of God. Like, oh, that's interesting. Like, have you looked at any of the arguments? Have you like read any material? Like, why do you say that? He was very I just don't think there's any evidence. Okay, I don't think there's any arguments for his existence. I just think it's made up. There's just nothing. And you could tell that he hadn't really engaged with actually thinking about this question. It was just his position, right, for whatever reason. And I asked him if he would be interested in hearing an argument for the existence of God. I'd be curious to see what he thought about it. Okay, and he was sure. He's a good-natured guy. He wasn't like confrontational or anything. So I just gave him very basic cosmological argument. William Lane Craig does this. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. And I was like, do you agree with that? And he was like, thought about it for a second. Like, yes, I agree. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. And I said, okay, the universe began to exist. Do you believe that? And he's like, yes. I'm like, great. He doesn't believe in an eternal universe, right? Because that's really the only option. You either say the universe began to exist, or the universe has always existed. And if it's always existed, then you have to take a different route. But he said, yes, the universe began to exist. And I said, okay, then the universe had a cause. And he's like, okay, yeah, the universe must have had a cause. And then we kind of dug in a little bit more, and I said, okay, well, the universe is all space, time, and matter, right? It's like, yes. So all space, time, and matter began to exist. It's like, right. And so if it began to exist, then the cause could not itself be space, time, and matter. It would have to have been spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, right? Because those things began to exist. They can't exist before it exists. And it's like, okay. I was like, well, what does that sound like to you? Well, it sounds kind of like God. Like, okay, now that we've talked about this, would you consider, like, have you moved a little bit? Would you like to, has the needle moved at all for you? And then he was just like, no, I just don't think there's good evidence. And it was just like, what? You agreed with my premises and the conclusion after that. And I share that story to tell you that, like, you can have the best arguments in the world. At the end of the day, someone needs to choose, right? They have to choose. Like, do I want to trust in God or not? Right? Do I want to trust in him? Do I want to trust in Jesus? All right. Now we're going to quickly go through some arguments. And if you want these, I can send you the slides afterwards. And then I have a list of resources at the end. And I didn't want to spend a whole bunch of time diving into each of these arguments because they can get a little bit tedious sometimes. This argument I gave and that I shared with this guy, with Jack, is known as the Cosmological Argument. And we went over it in the youth class because there's a lot of arguments out there that get you to God, right? But they don't necessarily get you to a personal God, right? It could be some force or some principle or something, right? How does it get you to a personal God, a personal deity, right? And so the first two premises there are the ones I've already shared. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Premise 3, an infinite chain of causes within the universe is impossible, so there must be a first cause. The first cause cannot be part of the universe, which is space, time, and matter, because it would then require a cause itself. And so what this does is it gets you back to a first cause that is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, okay? Which are all things that we believe about God, right? He's spaceless, right? He's timeless, he's eternal, right? He is immaterial, he's not made of matter, okay? From this argument, you could further suggest that, well, okay, if there's this spaceless, timeless, immaterial cause, it must also be personal because it would have had to have chosen to create the universe in the first place. So there you get to choice, right? A personal cause makes a choice. There's a will right there. Here's another one called the argument from contingency. And the idea with this argument is that everything that exists depends on something else to exist. Right? Everything we see in the world depends on something else to exist. 2, the whole universe is made up of things that depend on something else. So think of anything, right? Like, I don't exist of my own accord. Like, I'm not sitting here going, Levi exists. You just keep existing, buddy. Stay in existence, right? Right? Something causes you to persist in being, right? And you might say, well, it's my, all the atoms and stuff, and there's these laws, and they're just glued together, and whatever, science, right? It's like, well, those things themselves depend on something else. And at rock bottom, laws are not things of themselves, they're just describing the way things behave. And so the law of gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, all these things, these are just descriptions of reality, but they aren't explanations for the reality itself, right? It must depend on something else. There must be a reason for the way this thing exists, for its existence itself. And so, taking the argument further, there must be something that does not depend on something else, something that exists on its own, right? This is what we call necessary existence. It possesses existence on its own, okay? That independent something is what we call God. A bit more of a complicated argument, but I think it's more powerful if you understand it. Because it's not just going back in time to the beginning of the universe. It's literally an argument for the right now, right? Your own existence cannot just, regress down in forever. Something has to be upholding you in being, right? And that thing itself must exist on its own, right? Reminded of Paul when he writes, or he's quoting the poets. Rick brought this up, for the unknown God, for in him we live and move and have our being, right? That's God. He's literally causing us to exist every moment of our being, every moment of our existence. The moral argument. A lot of people like this one. I like it because as soon as somebody complains about something evil in the world, you just the thing that you're using to argue against God, you kind of have to presuppose God in the first place to say that there is evil in the world, right? Because there has to be good, right? And if there's truly good in the world, there has to be a source of that good, right? Well, it sounds like you have to say that there is a God who makes the world good, and then we mess it up. But the argument goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. It's a simple syllogism. If God exists, or if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. There's a universal sense of good and evil, right? Yes, that can be corrupted, right? But on the whole, we recognize that there are real moral truths. Otherwise, you'd never complain about anything evil in the world. Whenever we say that something is truly good or truly evil, we're appealing to a standard above us. And so the moral argument is saying that God, a moral lawgiver, is the best explanation for that, right? You don't get an ought from an is. You don't get moral law from nature, right? There has to be something higher than that. And the last argument we'll look at real briefly, which is a fun one. It's called the teleological or the design argument. To kind of illustrate this argument with the youth, I just did a little exercise, a thought exercise with them. I said, okay, imagine you're walking on the beach and you find a watch in the sand. Maybe it's a Rolex. I don't know. You take it, put it in your pocket, go home and sell it, and now you're like, woohoo! No, but you find this watch in the sand, right? And a watch, they're not simple, right? They're complicated little pieces of machinery. But suppose you look at the watch, you go, oh wow, this watch here. Found this watch. It must have washed in from the ocean. And before that, there was a bunch of rocks and minerals, and there's the swirling ocean, and maybe some organisms came together, and they formed this watch, right? And you have this watch now. Like, no. You go, this watch is here because somebody lost it, right? Somebody lost it, and the person who lost this watch, they bought it from somewhere. They got it, right? They bought it from a store. And before that, the watch was designed in a machinery. But even before that, maybe it was mass-produced. Who knows, right? Even before that, somebody had to come up with the blueprints to create this magnificent Rolex watch, right? It was designed, right? It didn't show up here on the beach by accident, okay? You take it further, okay, well, that's what we would say about a watch, right? Something as simple or maybe complex as a watch, we say there has to be a designer, okay? Well, as complex as a watch is, it's nothing compared to you or any of you or to the human eye or to the cell, right? There's to the intricacies of the universe, macro or micro, down at the molecular level up to universes and galaxies. There's no comparison between the Rolex watch and just what we find in the created order. And so the argument is from the smaller to the greater, right? If this watch requires a designer, as simple as it is, then how much more does something like a human being or just the universe itself, nature, how much more does that require a designer, right? That's the way the argument goes. But to formalize it, every design has a designer. The universe shows evidence of design, therefore the universe has a designer, right? Something designed this universe, right? And you could really get into the weeds with this. There's apologists out there who spend a lot of time on this argument. You know, the intelligent design crowd, right? That's like a field, I suppose. You awake, Stephen? So that is an argument that I really like it because it's very simple to grasp and understand, and most people recognize that, yeah, we live in a very complex world. And if this world is this complex and more simpler things require a designer, why wouldn't the universe require a designer as well? So that's what I got for you, okay? I put some resources up here. Again, if you want the slides, if you want the list, I can get it to you. But just a few books, okay? I'm glad you asked. That's the one that we're using, that we're taking the big questions from that book, and that's what we're presenting during this apologetic study. Another great classic is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, okay? Highly recommend. If you haven't read that, you need to read it, okay? The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's another great one, just basically on the resurrection, like on Jesus. He was an atheist. Lee Strobel was an atheist who became a Christian because he was an atheist. I think he was a journalist, right? Yeah, he was a journalist, atheistic journalist, and he was setting out like, I'm going to do like this piece on Jesus and show that there's like no evidence that he existed, that he died, that he rose again, all this stuff. And he sets out and he becomes a Christian after looking into it. He becomes a Christian. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. So I brought up Dr. Geisler earlier. This gives like step-by-step arguments for the existence of God. It is a bit of a thick book, but I still think it's approachable. Tactics, Game Plan for Discussing Your Christian Convictions by Greg Koukl. Okay, another good one, just on more practical, like conversation-based stuff, kind of like what we did last year. And then On Guard, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision by William Lane Craig. So these are some resources that you can dive into, should you like. But yeah.
Would you please email that to us?
Yeah. I'll have my secretary do it. Yeah, I'll just send the slides out. Yep. I think we have a closing song. All right. Well, appreciate you guys' time. I hope this was helpful. It's a fun topic, and I'm looking forward to us diving more into it over the summer.